So the title of my talk today is Knowledge, Identity, and Social Change, Expanding the Vygotskian Project in Educational Theory and Practice. And first I'd like to thank Professor Liubamirskaitė and Simona Vianna from the Alternative Education Project for this invitation. I'm very honored to be here with you today. Actually, I chose an epigraph for my talk, which is that there's nothing more practical than a good theory, which is a famous aphorism by Kurt Lewin, the famous 20th century psychologist. And Anna Statsenko was my advisor in graduate school, and with whom I still collaborate. She likes to complement this sentence with that there's nothing more theoretical than a good practice. And I feel that this really translates very well what I do, who I am, and what I believe, because I work very much at the intersection of theory and practice. I'm very interested in theory, and I do find that theory is a great tool for practice. And so today, I'm actually going to talk about one particular research project and that I carried out, and if we have time maybe for discussions, I can talk about more about other research projects in which the work was based on drawing on cultural historical theory in particular to analyze a certain problem in an institutional context, and then to propose an alternative solution. So let me start with some very general words just to frame my thought. So theory is usually portrayed as something ethereal, in the clouds, right? An ivory tower endeavor not relevant for practical endeavors. Right? But whether we recognize it or not, right? Theory always guides our practice. We always act based on certain assumptions. Right? And broad theoretical concepts in human development, that's what I'm going to emphasize today. And because those theoretical concepts, even though they're very broad, I believe that they're indispensable tools for us to reflect on social practices, particularly in education, thus enabling us to more systematically design curriculum and pedagogy. Okay. So the overarching framework for this talk, which I know it sounds very broad, is that we need to ask this question: what is the role of education in our societies today? How can educational practices help us address the pressing issues confronting us today? Right? And not that I have a final already made answer to you, but I think I'm going to talk about how I try to think about these questions in my practice. And the context of this talk and of the project that I'm going to talk about is socially unequal societies. I'm originally from Brazil, and I've been living in the United States since 1996. Right? And these are very much class-based societies, right? With huge gaps between the haves and the have-nots. Right? So, and I cannot think about education and development without thinking, right? The role of education, right, in helping us build a more democratic and socially just society. And I do believe that we need to think broadly and deeply, no matter how mundane our practices may look. Right? So, so I will start with my serendipitous journey as an educator in a continuous search of a deep developmental foundation in order to more fully comprehend the social practices in which I participate and contribute to, while collaborating with my partners in interrelated communities of people seeking to close gaps and overcome contradictions in social practices. And the main message that I want to convey today, am I too fast? Yeah? Okay, I'll slow down. This is just the introduction. Right? So the main message that I would like to convey is that development cannot be understood apart from learning, and learning cannot be understood without development. Right? And typically, very commonly, these are taken as two separate processes with very little connection between the two. Perhaps this insight, almost 100 years old, is not and should not be new to you, right? But regrettably, it's still sorely missing in most current theorizing in education and psychology, which is manifest in educational practices. So, drawing on the legacy of Piaget, Dewey, and Vygotsky, I would like to start with the foundation that the human mind is a social, dynamic system of activities that meaningfully connects us to the world and others around us. And I hope to make this theoretical abstraction very concrete, and to demonstrate how grasping it informs and can make our practice move forward in the direction of social justice. So let me tell a little bit about my theoretical practical journey. I started off in medical school in Brazil, where I could witness firsthand the limitations of the medical model, especially as it was applied to developmental and educational issues in children. I did an internship in neural child psychiatry in Rio de Janeiro, and it was very interesting that most of the children that were referred to that service, they had already been referred to a pediatrician, a speech therapist, a psychologist, and their problems, behavioral problems or inability to pass their grades, school failure in one way or another, their problems were always connected, right, to schooling, to educational practices. And at the time, the program was addressing these issues based on Vygotsky's cultural historical theory. So that was my introduction to that. And one of the most exciting programs that we had at that department was called demedicalizing school failure, right? Not to treat that, right, as a psychiatric, as a medical problem. So after that internship, so that, amazingly, I found that really responded to my aspirations to pursue a career that I felt I could make a contribution to bring about a new democratic society from the ashes of a capitalist dictatorship in the late 80s, right? That most Latin American countries were experiencing. Right? So I grew up in a military dictatorship, and that was the end of it. Right? So the first point that I want to make is the difference between a developmental and a medical approach, which regrettably is coming, especially in the United States, has grown disproportionately. Psychiatry has pretty much taken over clinical psychology, right? And this is influencing the whole hemisphere. I guess I already mentioned this problem here, that the children, they were referred to these specialists who attempted to fix them one way or another, right? But always seeing the problem as residing, located in the child's mind. And unfortunately, in the absence of a strong theoretical background in human development, even in their best intentions, all they could do was reproduce deficit and psychopathological models. So this is my first broad theoretical point, that I argue that we need to move away from such deficit views, right? Which is based on this notion that we have, that human individuals have inherent capacities, usually understood as biologically fixed and genetically predetermined. And as I was working with those children during my residency and internship, I could see from my direct experience, right, that the children were so malleable, they were so flexible. As I started to interact with them, right, so they were becoming somebody else, right? Children who could not pay attention, then in the course of certain activities, they could pay attention, right? Children who were not motivated, and they were expressing interest. Children who could not, who were said unable to self-regulate themselves, right? So, and this, fit neatly into sociocultural theories of development, right? According, based on this very basic notion that that's one of the most basic notions in sociocultural theory, that social interactions are at the center of development, and that's what guided our approach at the time. So we're trying to move beyond clinical models that posited that children suffered from psychopathology and implementing a developmental approach based on establishing learning communities through which children could reconstruct the meaning of social practices and engage in meaningful learning. So now I'm going to talk about how theory directly affects my practice, or it guides my practice. So I'm going to move now to my own practical endeavors to discuss how these theoretical concepts underpin educational practices in education and other related institutions. So first, I will present a case of a collaborative, transformative project that I carried out in a group home, which is a foster care program in the New York tri-state area. This program was in critical need for change, as conflict was rampant and the outcomes were dismal. And what I hope to demonstrate is the practical importance of conceptualizing human mental processes, right? Conceptualizing mind, right, as profoundly social dynamic processes rather than biologically predetermined individual properties or faculties. So I'm going to go over the next set of slides just rather quickly, just to give you some background. The idea was to foster learning and development with foster care youth. So the research project in the foster care program, which is a group home that housed 10 boys at a time, ages 12 to 18. And these were children who had been removed from their families or they were abandoned due to abuse and neglect. So a group home is a type of a residential facility where children live there, right, for abandoned and maltreated children under the aegis of the child welfare system. Now, youth growing up in these child welfare programs in the United States, they encounter enormous obstacles that drastically hinder their academic achievement and limit their chances of creating equitable futures for themselves and to lead a productive and fulfilling lives based on meaningful contribution to society. So my objective was twofold. So drawing on insights from constructivist developmental theories, especially Vygotskian, cultural historical psychology, as well as critical pedagogy, I hope to demonstrate on the one hand how under-theorized conceptions of human development, including pervasive and ill-defined allusions to mental health, significantly contribute to the obstacles faced by youth as they engage in educational and related social practices that inevitably are shaped by assumptions about human development. And on the other hand, I intend to offer an alternative to current practices that seek to address youth's problems, such as child welfare practices in the United States, based on a developmental approach that places teaching and learning at the center of those practices. So let me give you some just very general background here. Who are the youth in U.S. foster care? So just to give a broad picture, right? So the latest statistics from 2010, and this was after I did my project, that there are approximately 754,000 children were confirmed to be victims of maltreatment in the United States. And there are major types of maltreatment: neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and emotional abuse. Now, in 2010, there were about 400,000 children in foster care. And so it's an inordinate number. And 254,000 children entered foster care that year. Now, those children in the foster care, they're disproportionately represented by race and ethnicity. So if you look here, right, the child population by race, right, 53% of the child population in the United States is children, they're white children from European heritage children. Right? Blacks constitute 14% of the population. But if you look at the statistics of those children in foster care, you'll see that 40% are white, right? And 29% are black. And let me also give you some statistics on child poverty in the US. So in 2010, 15% of the population in the US lived in poverty. And the poverty rate in 2010 was the highest since 1993. And obviously we're talking about this is in the aftermath of the 2008 financial meltdown, and we're still in the recession in the United States. So now, children represent a disproportionate share of the poor in the United States. They are 24% of the total population, but 36% of the poor population. In 2010, 16.4 million children were poor in the United States. And the poverty rate also varies substantially by race. And so, as you can see here. So, 60 million children are poor in the United States. Of those, right, 5 million are white, which is 12%, and 4,817,000, or 38%, are black, and 6 million, more than 6 million of these children are Hispanic, or 36%. So now, children in these welfare programs, they have very the outcomes for the children are very poor. Right? They have poor developmental, mental, and educational outcomes, including low academic achievement, adaptive skills, behavior, cognition, language, and social skills. So this is typical of the literature on social work research. So my contention is that inadequate conceptions of child development contribute, right, to inadequate child welfare practices, and hence, right, to poor outcomes. So what I'm going to do now is to describe the foster care program as I encountered it when I started to work there. Okay, so the context of the study was this group home, right, with 10 boys and 1 executive direction, a manager, social workers, 6 youth counselors, and their job was to monitor the boys and make sure that their chores and the study would get done. Right? So the program had a very stable routine with a well-structured schedule of activities. So they would go to school, then come back and rest between 3 and 4. And they go to school in the morning, come back at 3, then they have a study hour from 4 to 5 p.m. Then they had to do their chores, do laundry or clean the house. Then they had they were taken to a recreation center, then they had dinner, and they would go to sleep. Right? Now, one of the main problems in the program occurred here during study hour, because the boys resisted it. There was almost no studying going on, with very few exceptions. And there was constant conflict with the staff because the boys were constantly violating the rules and the regulations of the program. They would constantly engage in rough play and teasing. They would evolve into disrespect and confrontation with the staff. So I quickly learned that there was a basic contradiction in institutional practices regarding its dynamic of power, right? And it was between control and resistance. Right? So there were these constant clashes between the staff's aspirations and views of a youth under their purview, and the boys' aspirations and views of their own situation. Now, having been removed from their families and thus having their lives controlled by several and poorly coordinated professionals, caseworkers, program staff, judges, health professionals, guidance counselors, all these people were making decisions about their boys' lives without including them for the most part. Right? So these boys had a history of multiple out-of-home placements, and they had very little control over their lives, right? And very limited participation in decision-making about their lives and their future. So consequently, they felt oppressed, and they sought to assert their constrained agency, insisting on making choices which usually meant resisting institutional rules. Right? And moreover, the boys reproduced a hierarchical system among themselves, in which the tougher boys, right, oppressed the younger ones or the weaker ones, who had to seek protection against bullying by forming alliances, right, typically unstable and short-lived. As a consequence, the boys adopted a strong individualist stance, which was manifest also in their discourses about having to be tough, having to fend for themselves, and not letting others take advantage of them. Right? And as I already mentioned, they resisted school learning, right, which was expressed in accusations of their teachers' pedagogical incompetences. They would say that their teachers didn't know how to teach them, that their classes were boring, and they also felt discriminated for being foster care children. They felt stigmatized in their schools. Now, the staff view of the boys was that those boys were undisciplined, disorderly, disrespectful, and that they were emotionally disturbed. They were excessively angry, they didn't know how to control themselves, so they thought that they needed structure. Right? And they attributed the boys' problems to their history of abuse and neglect by the dysfunctional families, right? Which makes sense. Well, they were neglected, they were abused, they were taken from their home, so right, they are emotionally disturbed. Right? That was the notion. Now, of course, the boys contested that. They didn't see themselves as suffering from psychopathology. They didn't think they had emotional problems. And they blamed the staff and their authoritarian ways for making them angry. So the staff took it as their job to ensure the maintenance of institutional practices and compliance to its rules by controlling the boys with punitive measures. Right? So, threatening to discharge them from the program, and withholding the boys' weekly allowance. So as I said, right, the staff's interpretation was that the boys suffered from emotional disturbances due to their histories of prior abuse and neglect. On their part, right, the boys attributed their actions and attitudes to their staff's authoritarian practices. According to them, the staff was unfair, did not listen to them, adopted collective punishment, and played favoritism, right? Charges denied by the staff. So the boys mistrusted professionals and doubted that they were acting on their best interest. And moreover, they accused professionals of breaking up their families and impeding their unification. So these clashing views led to constant confrontations between boys and staff. Right? So the boys were locked in a them versus us, antagonistic power struggle. And this has been described by a social worker who worked for 40 years in the United States, and he called this situation like custodialism, right? Which is pretty much a vicious circle, right? That works this way. As the staff measures further restricted the boys' agencies, right? The boys constantly rebelled against the punishment and resisted the psychopathological labels that were given to them. Right? Now, sadly, even though both staff and residents have a strong ethnic and racial identification with African Americans and Latinos with a common history of hardship and poverty, they share a strongly critical view of inequality and oppression in American society, and they could not overcome their antagonistic agendas. So despite frequent moments in which they would share cultural practices, listening to music together, playing sports, participating in community events, they could not act in solidarity with one another. And also, it became very obvious to me how the part of the problem was that the discourses, the kinds of generalizations that they were making about one another, and those also were very contradictory. Right? So they constantly drew on stereotype discourses on how to confront racial inequality, how to be prepared, right? Or how to prepare the boys, and the boys how to prepare themselves to deal with a structurally racist society. So on the one hand, they would portray themselves, right, blacks and Latinos, as victims, right, of historically conditioned oppression with roots in slavery. And at the same time, they would blame themselves. They said that they were also responsible for their own shortcomings due to their quote-unquote wrong values, such as prioritizing consumerist needs over hard work and education. So they were vacillating, went back and forth between conformist and resistant positions. Right? And deficit views were part of such discourses, and they emphasized the need to discipline and correct, right, to fix the boys, right, leading the staff to take the incongruous position of punishing the victims, as they seemed not to see viable alternatives to controlling the boys. Right? And in fact, many of the African American youth counselors, who also had grown up in hard conditions, right, had gone through a rebellious phase in their life that brought negative outcomes for their lives. So they thought that they learned the hard way, and they thought that they need to impart that knowledge for the boys. That eventually the boys would need to learn that you have to conform to the rules, you have to conform to social structures, even though they knew those structures, right, to be unfair. Right? So there was an interesting contradiction. So actually, the staff thought that they were committed to a developmental view, right, for the boys, centered on the need to conform to society, right, as rebelliousness was seen as not only futile, but detrimental to their stability. Right? Moreover, right, the meaning of learning was also very contradictory. Right? They would repeat over and over that knowledge is power, right, and that it's through the education is the great equalizer. Right? Your chances of upward mobility can only happen through education. So that was like a cliche. So they would say that. Right? Now, unfortunately, individualist notions, right, of some quote-unquote naturally imposed limitations and constrained capacities hijack the emancipatory dimensions of such discourses on knowledge as empowerment. Okay? And support for the boys' schoolwork was very limited. It was pretty much up to the boys whether they study or not. Right? The staff was not really prepared to deal with that. And the fact that most boys did not really care, did not take seriously their studies, seemed to confirm, right, the staff's opinion that these boys had some, right, problems, that they suffered some intrinsic lack of motivation, right, and that they were not able. And actually, I'll tell you about what I did, but I was trying to move the program in another direction, and the manager would tell me all the time, Eduardo, right, you're going to waste your time, right, because these boys, some of them, that's just how they are. They are not very bright, right, there's nothing you can do, right. You can't help everybody. Each individual is different, right? And that's it. Right? And the boys' academic performance was, pretty horrible, right? Some boys were staying back, for 2 or 3 years, and which was not surprising. Looking at, when I was looking at how they were doing homework, was so mechanical. Just, memorization and drills. That's what the kind of homework that they would get. And with rare exceptions, right? So learning was perceived as a forced chore, right? And school knowledge was not seen as something practically useful to them, right? And this was not a contradiction, because if you ask those boys, right, what do you want to do when you grow up? They would tell you, right? They had desires to become professional liberals, lawyers and architects, right? Which the staff thought it was far-fetched, right? Well, right? How can you even desire to be a professional, right, with this kind of grades that you have? Right? Okay, so at some point I started to work with the boys and tutoring them, and it was just so amazing. The lack of understanding of scientific concepts, the enormous degree of alienation and disconnection in their school work. I just have one quick quote here that was, it's so fun. It would be funny if you were not tragic. So this boy had a schoolwork, was doing homework, and he was learning social studies, the difference between industrialized and developing nations. So, and he couldn't grasp it. So I was trying to make that more concrete, and I asked, do you see a difference between countries like the United States, England, France, and countries in Africa? And it's like, oh, I do. The U.S. has more people in it. Right? So they said, well, that's not the point. Right? So I gave it a brief explanation of the wealth, right, of industrialized nations. And he turns to me and is like, is the United States rich? I was like, yeah, it's the richest country in the world. And then another boy who was there is like, the United States is rich, huh? And then he left and said, well, not that everybody's rich in the United States, but the country itself is rich. And it's like, oh, I was about to say that. Obviously, they showed that all they knew was poverty, and they could not even understand, right, that they were living in a country that the country itself was rich. So the education expectations for those boys were very limited, right? College was considered to be out of reach. So the viable options that the program saw was vocational education, right? That they would be trained in some practical trades, or entry in the low-wage job market, right? Which the boys resisted because they insisted on escaping poverty. And so the staff, for example, wanted them to work at McDonald's or Burger King or something like that, right? They were making minimum wage. And the boys knew that, well, you go nowhere. And it's a fact. If you start, right, the statistics show that very clearly. If you start at the low wage job market, you go nowhere. Right? It's almost impossible to work those jobs and study and then get a better job. So you stay for that, right, for the rest of their lives. So the boys are like, I don't want that. Right? So one day, one boy said this to me, that I will not spend my life asking paper or plastic. So he was trying to working at a grocery store, right? That they would, and some other boys would tell me bluntly, I'd rather sell drugs than be poor, right? Now for the staff, this was another sign of how immature the boys were, right? That they refused to accept reality, right? And they thought that, well, right, we need to teach them, right, to understand this. Now, right, so you see, there's all these layers of, right, constraining their aspirations, right, which intensify their sense of having constrained agency, which further their rebelliousness. So, now, what was going on in the program, interestingly, even though the staff in the program, they didn't really read anything about social work research, they were not conversant in the literature, they were not knowledgeable about this. Mm-hmm.
What is their educational stuff in principle?
Okay. The manager had a college degree, like a bachelor's degree, but the youth counselors, they only had high school, and so very, very low, and they had no experience or professional development in education. So they were the social work literature on foster kids, right, also emphasizes, right, psychological disorders. Right? So, for example, two researchers in this field, I'm going to quote them. They said they wrote that maltreated children's developmental trajectory is disproportionately compromised and leads to disproportionate involvement in the mental health, juvenile justice, adult criminal justice, and social service systems. And so, as Polsky contended, the prevailing viewpoint is that children in trouble suffer from psychopathology and therefore they need psychotherapy. Right? So the idea is that youth suffering from unidentified social emotional disturbances may not be receiving appropriate mental health and social services. So over the 90s and the early 2000s, the field almost unanimously reached that consensus on the importance of addressing the clinical needs of youth. Right? Now, glaringly, the role of present institutional practices are not taken into account. So everything is located in the boys' heads. Right? It's all inside their minds. And that's the source of the problem. And therefore, that's the locus of intervention. Right? We have to treat them.
So you should make an experiment and just to put normal children to the same foster homes and see what happens.
Well, they'll become sick. And this is consistent with traditional notions of psychological disorders as individual processes, right? Something that individuals have that's located in their minds or their brains. And ironically, even though everybody knew that the roots of these problems were environmental, right? After all, they were there because of abuse or neglect, right? But once, right, it's seen as, right, now it's in their heads, so right, that connection, right, was severed because, and there's one of the leading developmental psychologists in developmental psychopathology, Daniel Siketi in the United States, right? And that's his theory that, yeah, right? The source of the problem is environmental, but then it gets to your brain. Right? So then, right, the problem is internalized in the, in that sense, right? So to go back to my contention, right, which is that deficit conceptions of youth in child welfare practices, right, that these views obfuscate the role of inadequate institutional practices in society inequality in the genesis of these problems, and they disempower those kids, right? So in a way, it's like you blame the victim. Right? So I'm contrasting a mental health versus a developmental approach. And actually, this would be a good challenge. You can go to this literature, right? And they talk about mental health in almost every paper or every book. Mental health, but right? But what is mind is not addressed. Right? So if you want to know, if you know what is mental health, so what is, right? What is mind? There's no conception of that. It's taken for granted, right? It's something that's supposed to be evident, right? That if somebody's angry, somebody's having, right, not conforming to rules and aggressive, that the person has mental health issues, right? So obviously these notions, right, only reinforce this idea that there's something intrinsically problematic about those youths, right? Which perpetuates the gap, right? It also separates teaching and learning from development, which is the point that I'm going to get soon, right? And it creates this vicious circle in which developmental opportunities for foster youth are limited insofar as emphasis on treating psychopathology invariably relegates teaching and learning to a secondary plane, right? So we have this circle in which poor practices lead to poor outcomes, right? Which seem then to confirm these deficit views, right? And so now I'm going to talk about, right, alternative conceptions of human development, right? Well, there's another way, right, of looking at it. There's another way of conceptualizing, right, mind and development. And here is what I hope to show, that, right, that theory matters. It does make a difference, right? So the point that I want to emphasize, right, is the relational ontology of the human mind. Right? The mind is not something that simply we have inside our heads, but it's something that, right, is in our connections and our activities with the world, with other people, including the tools that we have access to. Right? The interdependence between theory and practice, right? The centrality of human action, right? And this dynamic integration of knowing and doing, and teaching, learning, right, and development as mutually constitutive. And I'll be drawing on cultural historical theory. And I was able to draw on cultural historical theory to design developmental teaching learning practices. Those views that I was mentioning in the program and in the child welfare research literature, they're not unique. They actually fit, right, with a much broader, larger pattern of splits and dualisms, right? And at the core of these traditional views in science in general, right, lies an essentialist, atomistic conception of social phenomena and human beings, right, as being thing-like entities that exist separately from each other, right? So people or things have a primary existence, and then they can come into contact with one another and influence, but they are primarily, right, separate and different. And so in this view, reality is split into all sorts of separate and interdependent realms. And learning and development are viewed as products of solitary and self-contained individual minds, endowed with an internal machinery of cognitive abilities and emotional motivational dispositions that await the right conditions to unfold, like personality traits and intelligence. And that's the traditional view in American psychology. Okay, right? In this view, knowledge is seen as a purely mental phenomenon, right, contained in a separate space of ideas and distance from the tangible, material, and messy processes in the world associated with doing things, right, rather than simply thinking about them or getting to understand them. Right? So knowledge, right, is mental, right, and is separate from action, right, material. So knowledge is viewed as the inner depiction of the representation of outer, mind-independent realities and phenomena that have very little to do with both practical actions in and on the world. Right? So it's something that you have in your head, right, within the individual. And mind is seen then as an individual property, something that individuals have. Right? We have certain amounts of intelligence, we have certain personalities, we have our personal memories. Right? And the traditional view of teaching and learning, right, is that these processes are, right, essentially different, right, only superficially related to one another, right, and thus how specific activities in which learners engage and the mental tools that they learn to use, how that affects the development of their minds, is a question that has rarely been clearly formulated. Right? So development is commonly viewed as a predetermined unfolding of natural characteristics, a necessary condition for learning. Right? And learning is typically seen as the mere acquisition of information or perfecting mechanical skills. Right? And knowledge is seen as something finite, static, ready-made, produced by experts or some authority, right, to be consumed by the learners, right, in a neutral and unproblematic way. And this is something that I struggle with my students at the college. So when I teach psychology courses or courses in education, and we cover different theories, right? And the students, in the beginning, they just look at me like, "Oh, can you just tell me which one is the right one or the one that you like, right?" Like I started over the years to appreciate that they think that knowledge is already there, right, made, and I just need to, right, to give it to them. They don't see how, right, knowledge is constructed, right, and how knowledge results from, right, our theories and our methods. So, if you teach something about the brain, and I over the years I started even to joke with them, like when I teach the brain, and I said, "Look, I didn't design the brain. It is very complex. You just have to deal with the complexity." And so they had this idea that some authorities, some experts already figured out how the brain works. Right? And my job, if I'm a good teacher, my job is to transmit that to them, right, in a very simple and clear way that they don't have to, right, burn the fuses, they don't have to be confused. So they don't understand, right, the limitations, that what's not known, right, perhaps about the brain is perhaps much more than what is known, right? Our knowledge is so tentative. So I'm going to turn now to constructivist theories, right, that move away from these traditional individualist views of mind and knowledge. Right? So perhaps the most basic claim of constructivist theories is that human mind is a dynamic, socially constituted system of action. And so constructivist theories posit psychological phenomena as processes embedded and co-constructed within context and intrinsically interwoven with them. Right? For Dewey, Piaget, and Vygotsky, human action, right, is the foundation of analysis, and human action as the process that connects individuals with their worlds. Right? And in all these theories, the growth of human action in its increasingly complex transformation is the origin of psychological processes. So they, right, all these theories, they posit no gaps between knowing and doing, right? And this is particularly evident in Piaget's descriptions of the first stages, when, right, for the infant and for the toddler, right? To know is to act, and to act is to know. So mind here is not a container that stores memories and knowledge, right? But instead it's a dynamic system formed in actions, right, and expressed, right, materialized in actions, right? And because these are action-centered theories, right, growth through increasing elaborateness of actions, right? Then in all these theories then, right, learning is connected with development. They conceptualize the relationship between these two processes. And I guess in a simple way, right, all the theories posit that children learn by doing, right, acting in and on the environment. Right? But now I want to move to cultural historical theory, right, that I think connects in a better way, learning and development. So let me give you this quote here from Vygotskian, right? That learning is not development. However, properly organized learning results in mental development and sets in motion a variety of developmental processes that would be impossible apart from learning. Okay? So we can ask some questions. Right? How are teaching, learning, and the development of children's minds related? Are these processes independent of one another, right? Or do they influence each other? And if they influence each other, right? How? In what ways? And by what means? Right? And I think this we need to address these questions. And especially the last one, can qualitatively new levels of intelligence be achieved as a result of learning? And this is something also that I always ask my students, because one of the ways that I try to stimulate them, to motivate them to learn, is to expose gaps, right, and contradictions in their thinking. So most of my students believe that somehow our intelligences, right, each individual has a certain intelligence, a certain amount of intelligence, which it's very much related to the practices of IQ measurement. Right? It's very common in the US to test children, and you get a score. So, right? So they think that each person has a certain amount of intelligence. Right? Exactly what that means, right? Nobody knows. Right? But the idea, and that is somehow fixed. You're born with that. So some people are, right? So we are not born equal. We're born different. Some people are born with more capacity, for certain things than others. Right? So most of my students believe that. But then, if I ask them, do you think that when people learn, they become more intelligent? Oh, yes, right? Like, well, so how can you put the two together? So, right? You need a theory, right? There's things are not coming together here.